Section 1. The Deepest Question. There is a version of this story that most people tell, and then there is the version that keeps you awake. The first version goes something like this. The Emperor of mankind was a being of unimaginable power who stood as the eternal defender against chaos, the undying bulwark between humanity and the howling dark gods of the warp. He feared chaos the way a lighthouse fears a storm constantly, vigilantly, forever. That version is not wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because the lore, when you dig into it past the surface mythology, past the incense and the golden statues and the thundering hymns of a trillion devoted worshippers, tells a different story. It tells the story of a being who watched civilizations rise and fall across tens of thousands of years. A mind so vast and so old that chaos itself, the howling gods of ruin and madness that drive lesser beings to despair, was something he understood, calculated, and factored into his plans the way a chess player factors in the opening moves of an opponent they have beaten 100 times before. Chaos was a threat. Chaos was a war. But chaos was not the thing that truly kept the Emperor awake. So what was? To answer that properly, we need to start at a place that most people skip over, because it feels like ancient backstory rather than the heart of the matter. It feels like preamble, but it is not. The deepest truths about the Emperor, what he feared, what he was actually trying to do, what he sacrificed, and why are inseparable from his origins. Not his origins as a ruler, or a general, or the architect of the Imperium. His origins as a mind, as a consciousness that had been alive long enough to see patterns that no other being in the galaxy could see, because no other being had been watching long enough to notice them. Think about what it means to be 50,000 years old. Not biologically preserved, not frozen in stasis, not sleeping through the centuries and waking periodically to check on things, but genuinely, continuously alive, present, thinking, observing, remembering every civilization that ever built something worth looking at, remembering every civilization that fell, watching the same mistakes recur across cultures that shared no language, no geography, no common history, only the shared architecture of what it means to be human and therefore subject to the same weaknesses, the same hungers, the same capacity for extraordinary greatness and extraordinary catastrophe. By the time the Emperor raised his banner over a unified Terra and sent his legions into the stars, he was not hoping, he was not guessing. He was executing the final phase of a plan that had been forming in the most sophisticated mind in human history for tens of thousands of years. Every piece of it, the Great Crusade, the Primarchs, the Webway Project, the Imperial Truth, the Grey Knights, the Custodians, every single piece was a calculated response to a specific threat that he had identified through 500 centuries of watching the galaxy and understanding, with painful clarity, what was coming. And what he feared most was not the thing most people think of when they imagine the Emperor's enemies. Chaos was something he understood. He had watched it form from nothing. He had seen the warp grow darker, generation by generation, as the collective emotional weight of billions of sentient minds poured into the immaterium. He had watched alien civilizations make choices that fed the growing entities of the warp, choices driven by the same universal tendencies, comfort, pleasure, pride, grief that made the chaos gods possible in the first place. He had tracked the process from the very beginning. Chaos was his oldest known problem. He had spent his entire existence thinking about it. What he feared, the thing that sits beneath every decision he made, that explains choices, his Primarchs found inexplicable, and his historians have debated ever since, was something else, something more intimate, something that could not be fought with armies, or countered with psychic power, or sealed behind a warded door. He feared what humanity would become if he failed in a specific, particular way. Not humanity consumed by chaos, not humanity destroyed by alien invasion or internal war. Something quieter, and in some ways more final, humanity evolving into a permanently stunted form of itself, a species that survived technically, but had lost the capacity to become what it was actually capable of. A species that had replaced genuine growth with the performance of continuity. A civilization that mistook the maintenance of its own forms for actual life. He feared the Imperium becoming not the first chapter of humanity's story, but the last one. He feared becoming a god, not as a metaphor, but in the literal, mechanical, warp physics sense of what it means for a being of his psychic magnitude to become the object of 1,000,000,000,000 prayers directed through the Imperium. He feared the thing that begins to take shape in the darkness beyond the galactic rim, that the lore gestures at without naming, that even the great devourer may have found reason to flee from. He feared the race against time, the psychic emergence of humanity happening too fast, without the protections he had spent his entire existence trying to put in place, turning the species into something that the entities of the warp would find irresistible. And underneath all of these specific fears, layering them together in a way that becomes more disturbing the longer you think about it, there is the deepest one, that he might be wrong. That his plan, the plan he had been developing for 50,000 years, the plan he had sacrificed more for than any other being in history, might simply not be sufficient. That the variables were too many, the contingencies too fragile, the window for success too narrow, to thread without losing something essential. We are going to walk through all of it, every layer, every connection, because this is one of those pieces of lore where the surface level is genuinely interesting, but the depth is where it becomes extraordinary. Before we go any further, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. And if you find this kind of deep lore dive valuable, hit subscribe. It means more than you know, and it helps more people find their way here. Let us begin at the beginning, the very beginning. Section 2. The Emperor's Origins, What He Witnessed at the Beginning. Approximately 10,000 years before the Common Era, roughly 8,000 years before the birth of Christ, which places us roughly 10 millennia before the first breath of the Imperium of man, a child was born in a primitive settlement along the banks of the Sakarya River, in what we now call Anatolia, in modern Turkey. The settlement was Proto-Hittite, Neolithic in character, its people still in the early stages of what archaeologists would eventually call the pre-pottery Neolithic period. They decorated the skulls of their dead with plaster, pressing shells into the empty eye sockets, preserving the faces of the beloved, gone in a practice of memory that speaks to something very human. The refusal to accept that the people we love simply disappear when they die. This is where he begins. In a village of people who painted the faces of their dead because they could not bear to forget them, the child born there would outlast every practice, every tradition, every civilization, every language that ever existed on this planet, and every other planet humanity would one day reach. He would watch the cultures that descended from that Neolithic world rise and fall and be forgotten. He would walk through cities that future archaeologists would not unearth for 40 millennia. He would advise kings and warlords and thinkers under names that were eventually lost even to the most comprehensive historical records. He would accumulate experience at a rate that no other consciousness in human history could match, because no other consciousness in human history lived long enough to match it. He was born a perpetual. In the lore of the 40th and 41st millennia, perpetuals are a specific and extraordinarily rare category of human beings who possess what amounts to true biological immortality. They do not merely age slowly. They do not simply resist injury better than ordinary humans. Perpetuals regenerate from everything, including death. Kill one, and, given sufficient time, they reform. The body rebuilds itself from whatever remains, driven by a biological process that the most advanced sciences of multiple eras have never been able to fully explain. They are, in the most literal sense, unkillable by conventional means, and they are aware of it. The psychological weight of knowing that you will recover from anything, that death is an interruption rather than an ending, shapes minds in ways that are very difficult for mortal beings to fully comprehend. But the Emperor was not merely a perpetual. Even among other perpetuals beings who had themselves lived through the fall of civilizations, who had accumulated centuries of experience and knowledge that ordinary humans could never reach, he was recognized as something categorically different, something that made even other immortals feel, in his presence, like they were children in the presence of something very old and very patient and very, very much aware of things they had not yet had time to learn. According to the deepest and most widely accepted strands of the lore, the being who became the Emperor was not simply a perpetual who happened to be unusually gifted. He was the collective reincarnation of thousands of human shamans who had existed in the earliest days of human history, the very first human psychers, the first individuals in whom the genetic changes that would eventually produce a fully psychic humanity had begun to express themselves. These shamans had, in the earliest eras before recorded history, possessed the ability to reincarnate. When they died, their psychic essence persisted in the warp and was eventually drawn back into a new body, carrying with it the fragments of accumulated wisdom that each lifetime had produced. Not memories in a precise sense, not the ability to recall specific events with perfect clarity, but the deeper pattern knowledge of many lives, the understanding of how things work, the instinct for consequences that only comes from having made a mistake and lived through it enough times to recognize it on sight. This process continued for millennia. The shamans died and were reborn, each cycle adding another layer to what they carried. And through all of this, through countless generations of this slow, cyclical accumulation, something in the warp was changing. The entities that would eventually crystallize into the 4 chaos gods were growing. Not yet the fully realized powers they would become. Not yet the beings capable of corrupting primarchs and breaking legions and rewriting the fundamental character of reality in their immediate vicinity, but growing. Fed by the collective psychic weight of billions of sentient creatures across the galaxy, humans who felt rage, humans who felt grief, humans who schemed and desired and suffered, alien races with their own emotional architectures, contributing their own psychic resonance to the swelling sea of the Imperium. The warp was darkening, thickening, its currents becoming more treacherous with every passing century. The shamans noticed. They had been attuned to the warp since birth, and they could feel it changing beneath them, the way a fisherman feels when the sea that has been predictable his entire life begins to behave in ways he does not recognize. The pathways of reincarnation that they had used for uncounted generations were becoming disrupted, corrupted. When shamans died now, their souls did not follow the familiar currents back to new bodies. They were caught, consumed. Whatever entities were forming in the darkening warp were feeding on them, and the cycle of reincarnation that had given the shamans their continuity across the generations was breaking down. They understood what this meant. Not in precise terms, they did not have the conceptual vocabulary for warp physics or psychic theory, or the mechanics of how entities form in the immaterium, but they understood it the way people in danger always understand things. In the gut, in the body, in the unmistakable sensation that the rules of the world have changed and the change is not in their favor. And so they made a choice. A collective choice, arrived at through what the lore describes as a kind of psychic communion, all of them connected, all of them aware of each other's thoughts and fears and accumulated wisdom, all of them coming to the same conclusion at the same time. They would not fight separately. They would not try to escape individually. They would pool everything they were, every life's worth of knowledge, every fragment of psychic power, every thread of continuity that they had preserved across the centuries of their cycling existence, and they would pour all of it into a single vessel, a single child, born into the world with the weight of thousands of lives already pressing behind his eyes. That was the sacrifice. That was the birth of the Emperor. The child who opened his eyes by the Sicaria River had not lived one life yet, but he carried the residue of thousands. As he grew, as his body developed, and his psychic abilities manifested, and he began to understand the nature of what he was, the memories and knowledge of all those previous existences pressed against the surface of his consciousness, like something trying to get through. He remembered slowly, not with the clarity of normal memory, but with the gradual recognition of patterns, the way you might wake from a dream and not remember the specific events, but feel the emotional weight of what happened there, and gradually, over the course of hours, piece together what you experienced. He remembered being a healer in a community that no longer existed. He remembered being a war leader for a people whose descendants became something else, evolved into cultures he would later walk through under different names. He remembered the warp. He remembered what it felt like when it was younger and less hostile, when the shamans moved through it with something approaching ease, and he remembered watching it change. This early memory, the memory of the warp as it was before the chaos gods fully formed, and then of watching those gods emerge from the growing darkness, is perhaps the single most important piece of context for understanding everything the Emperor subsequently did, because he was the only being in existence for the entirety of the history that we call recorded, who actually remembered what the warp was like before it was what it became. He remembered before chaos. Every other being in the 40th millennium who understands the warp at all understands it as a thing that has always been dangerous, always been corrupted, always been the domain of predatory entities. The four great powers are, from any contemporary perspective, simply the fundamental nature of the warp. They have been there, in their current form, for as long as anyone's records extend. The Chaos Gods are not a deviation from normal. They are normal. But the Emperor knew otherwise. He had been there before they solidified. He had felt the warp as a younger thing, stranger and more fluid and less defined. Not the howling ocean of malice it would become, but something rawer and more ambiguous. He had watched the darkness thicken. He had watched the entities form. He had experienced the specific, terrible understanding of watching something that was once merely uncertain become something that was actively, purposefully hostile. That knowledge, the knowledge that the current state of the warp is not inevitable, that it is not what the warp fundamentally is, but what it has become through specific processes over specific periods of time, and that those processes are theoretically reversible, or at least interruptible, is the foundation of everything. It is why he believed his plan could work, when any less informed mind might have looked at the scale of what he was attempting, and concluded that it was hopeless. He did not believe chaos was eternal. He had been alive when it was not yet what it would become. He knew it could be otherwise. He grew older. He traveled. He learned every skill that each lifetime had left its residue on, and added to them the new skills each successive decade brought. He was a warrior, an advisor, a king, a wanderer. He fought and he thought and he observed, and slowly, over the centuries, the plan took shape, not as a sudden vision, but as the patient accumulation of a conclusion that his experience kept confirming from different angles. The problem was always the same. The solution always pointed in the same direction. The only question was whether there was time. He learned to hide. He understood, very early, that his presence, his nature, his psychic magnitude, his actual identity would make him a target, not just for the entities forming in the warp, though those were real enough, for human beings, for the institutions and power structures that depended on the status quo, that would find the existence of a being like him fundamentally threatening to whatever arrangements they had made with the world. He spent tens of thousands of years under different names, in different roles, watching from within rather than from above, learning the ways that civilizations actually worked rather than the ways they claimed to work. And through all of it, he was watching the warp, tracking the trajectory of its development, building, in the most sophisticated mind in human history, a model of what was coming and what would be required to give humanity any chance of surviving it. The fear that this watch engendered was not the fear of someone who has seen a monster and recoiled from it. It was the fear of someone who has been tracking a process long enough to understand where it inevitably leads and who is not certain they can change that destination in the time available. Section 3. The Imperial Truth, a Lie, disguised as enlightenment. When the Emperor launched his great crusade, when he stood at last on the soil of a unified Terra and sent his vast legions of transhuman warriors out into a galaxy that had spent thousands of years in darkness and suffering and desperate isolation, he carried with him an official philosophy, a state creed not of worship and submission, but of reason and empirical inquiry. The Imperium would not be a theocracy. It would not be built on faith in divine power, or fear of supernatural punishment, or the desperate hope of an afterlife that made present suffering bearable. It would be built on the observable, the measurable, the demonstrable, on the scientific method, on the human capacity for rational thought applied to the real problems of real existence. This philosophy was called the Imperial Truth, and on the surface, in the context of the galaxy, the Emperor was inheriting a galaxy where false gods and real demons had filled the vacuum left by collapsing civilization, where terrified populations had turned to anything that promised meaning in the dark, where psychic cults and warp-worshipping cabals had spread across worlds like infections. It was a genuinely radical and admirable idea. The Emperor punished religious practice. He executed those who proclaimed divinity for themselves or for him. He famously and furiously censured the Primarch Lorgar, one of his own sons, a being he had created and shaped, because Lorgar's deep devotion to his father had led him to build entire cities to the Emperor's glory and instruct his people to worship their creator as a god. The Emperor came to Lorgar's world of Monarchia with the Ultramarines at his back and ordered the city leveled while Lorgar watched. Then he made Lorgar kneel in the rubble and wait while the Emperor stood over him in silence. The message was unambiguous. This is not what I want from you. This is not what any of this is for. He wanted humanity to think, not to pray, not to prostrate itself before power it could not understand, to think, to question, to build knowledge that could be used, to treat the universe as a place that operated according to discoverable rules, rather than as an arena for divine drama in which ordinary humans were nothing but props. But there was something at the heart of the imperial truth that its name almost perfectly described, and not in the way its architects intended. The imperial truth was, in several fundamental ways, not true. The Emperor knew chaos was real. He had known it was real for tens of thousands of years. He had personally witnessed its effects on civilizations that no one else alive even remembered. He understood, better than any other being in the galaxy, that the four great powers of the Warpcorn, the god of slaughter, Tziench, the god of change and manipulation, Nurgle, the god of entropy and disease, and the nascent Slaanesh, who would not be fully born until the fall of the Eldari, were not metaphors or frightening stories told by primitive peoples who did not understand the world. They were real entities. They had real power. They fed on real human belief and real human emotion in ways that were not symbolic, but mechanically, physically, literal. The prayers of 1 billion devotees to a dark god did not simply make people feel they were in communion with something. They made that something stronger. And yet the imperial truth denied the supernatural existed at all. It denied the warp as a spiritual dimension. It denied the relevance of daemons as genuine threats deserving of preparation and countermeasure. It denied, critically, the existence of what any ordinary person with ordinary religious intuition might call a soul, the persistent aspect of consciousness that outlasts the body's death, that is vulnerable to the entities of the Imperium, that is the specific thing that the Chaos Gods most urgently want to possess. Why would the Emperor do this? Why would the being who had spent 50,000 years understanding chaos more deeply than any other consciousness in the galaxy actively hide that understanding from the civilization he was building? The answer he gave when pressed by Malkador, by the most trusted of his sons, by the chaplains and scholars who found the contradiction troubling, was that belief itself was the problem. That knowledge of the Chaos Gods was not neutral information. The way knowing about a dangerous species of predator is neutral information that helps you avoid it. Knowledge of the Chaos Gods, specifically, was a form of engagement with them. To fear Khorne was to feed Khorne. To revere Tziench was to serve Tziench. To dread Nurgle was to invite his attention. The specific mechanism of how warp entities became powerful made awareness of them, under certain conditions, functionally equivalent to worship of them. A civilization educated about chaos might find itself empowering it through the very act of taking it seriously. There is a genuine and sophisticated logic to this position that we should not dismiss too quickly. The warp does not operate by the rules of normal causality. Belief shapes it. Emotional investment shapes it. The Chaos Gods are not merely beneficiaries of worship. They are, in a real and mechanistic sense, made of it. Their power is literally constituted by the psychic resonance of the beings who acknowledge them, fear them, pray to them, fight them with sufficient passionate hatred that the fighting itself becomes a form of devotion. The Emperor had watched, through millennia of careful observation, what happened to species and civilizations that became deeply engaged with the four great powers. The engagement did not free them from the power's influence. It deepened it. But the imperial truth was also hiding something more personal, something that went beyond the protective rationale of not teaching a galaxy to feed its worst nightmares. The Emperor was hiding his own nature. Because if the imperial truth was correct, if the supernatural did not exist, if gods were merely stories, if the warp was simply a dimension of practical utility rather than a mirror of the soul, then what was the Emperor? He was a psyker, the greatest psyker who had ever lived or ever would live. He was a being whose presence in the Imperium was so vast, so dense, so extraordinary, in its concentration of psychic power, that to call him a psyker, the way one might call another person a psyker, was rather like calling the ocean wet water, technically accurate, and profoundly inadequate. And he had spent 50,000 years watching beings of great psychic power interact with the worship of smaller beings. He had watched what happened when an entity of sufficient warp presence became the object of sufficient belief. He had seen the mathematics of it, the mechanism, the inexorable process by which concentrated belief, directed through the Imperium toward a psychically powerful focus, began to reshape. That focus began to make it into something other than what it had been, something that was defined by the worship rather than by its own nature. He had watched gods be born. He had been present, in some fashion, for the formation of the chaos gods themselves. He understood what the process looked like from the beginning, and he could see it happening to himself. When Lorgar worshipped him and his people prayed to him, the Emperor did not simply feel honored or moved or uncomfortable with the attention. He could feel, in the Imperium, what the accumulated belief of a world was doing to his psychic presence there. He could feel the slow reshaping beginning, the way the entity he was in the warp was starting to be defined, not by his own consciousness and will, and accumulated 50,000 years of considered thought, but by the image that billions of desperate worshippers were projecting onto him, something grander than he was, something simpler, something that answered to the emotional needs of its worshippers, rather than to the reality of what he had actually chosen to be. He was afraid of losing himself. Not to death he had survived countless times. Not to physical injury. His perpetual nature would eventually heal even the most catastrophic wounds. He was afraid of losing himself to deification, of the personality and consciousness and genuine concern for humanity's future that he had maintained across 50,000 years of existence, being slowly overwritten by a divine persona that was the creation of a galaxy's worth of frightened prayer. He was afraid that the cure would become the disease, that he, the being who had spent his entire existence trying to free humanity from the parasitic relationship with warp entities that fed on belief, would become precisely such an entity, a god made from human need, nourished by exactly the kind of desperate devotion he had tried so hard to suppress, answering to nothing genuinely human anymore, because what fed him was not the reality of what humanity was, but the projection of what humanity needed him to be. The imperial truth was, in part, an attempt to prevent this, by suppressing religion, by actively pushing against the instinct to deify, by refusing the worship that his presence inevitably attracted. He was trying to keep the process from reaching a point of no return. By denying the supernatural, he was denying the specific mechanism that turned powerful beings into gods. What he could not fully prevent was the irony that lies at the core of the entire post-heresy Imperium. The civilization he built survived because of him. Survived because of the throne that keeps his psychic beacon burning, because of the Astronomicon that allows warp travel, because of the institutions and the space marines and all the structures he put in place. And precisely because it survived because of him, it devoted itself to him. The more desperately humanity needed the Emperor, the more fervently it worshipped him. The more fervently it worshipped him, the more completely he became the thing he had always tried not to be. The thing he feared most, from the beginning, was already happening before he died. He just could not find a way to stop it without also stopping the things that were keeping humanity alive. Section 4. The Webway Project, Severing Humanity from the Warp Forever. Approximately 2 centuries into the Great Crusade, after the campaigns that were slowly pulling scattered human civilization back from the edge of extinction world by world, system by system, the gradual reconstruction of something that resembled a unified species, the Emperor did something that confused and wounded many of his Primarchs deeply. He stopped participating directly. He handed the War Master's authority to Horus, his favorite, his most trusted general, the son in whom he had placed the greatest confidence, and he returned to Terra, not to govern, not to rest, to work, in secret, in the labyrinthine chambers beneath what would become the Imperial Palace, in tunnels sealed against all entry but the most absolutely trusted servants. The Emperor began a project that he called the Great Work, a deliberately vague name designed to obscure its true nature from anyone who might stumble across a passing reference to it. to Malcador, his closest advisor and confidant, to the most senior of his custodians, who would guard the work with their lives without being told precisely what they were guarding. He called it the Webway Project, and it was the most ambitious and most revealing thing he ever attempted. To understand what he was trying to do, you have to understand the Webway itself, and the Webway is one of the most elegant and fascinating concepts in all of 40K's extensive lore. The Aeldari, or the Eldar, as they are more commonly known, are a species that is older than humanity's agriculture, older than humanity's cities, older than most of humanity's recorded history. They reached the height of their civilization millions of years ago, developing technologies and capabilities that the Imperium of the 41st millennium can barely conceive of, let alone replicate. Among the greatest of their achievements was the Webway, an artificial dimension, a constructed network of psychic corridors threaded between the material universe and the warp, existing in the space between the two without being fully part of either. The Webway is not the warp. You do not navigate it through the Imperium, guided by the psychic sensitivity of a navigator and the flickering light of a psychic beacon. You enter it through specific physical portals, doors, essentially, built into the structure of real space, and travel through tunnels that bypass the warp entirely. The journey is relatively safe, at least in the intact sections. No warp currents to fight. No demonic entities drifting through the medium you are traveling in, looking for an unguarded ship or an unprotected mine to attach themselves to. No need for navigators or Geller fields or the constant grinding vigilance that warp travel demands. You simply move through the tunnels and emerge, potentially on the other side of the galaxy, having experienced something approaching normal travel in a dimension that does not want to kill you. The Aeldari used it to connect their empire. They traveled between their worlds in relative safety and relative speed, maintaining the cohesion of a civilization that spanned enormous distances without the nightmare that is warp travel. Their empire was vast and their culture was rich, and their existence, for a very long time, was genuinely magnificent until they destroyed it themselves through the specific mechanism of civilizational self-destruction that we will come to later. But while it lasted, the Webway was how they held it together. And then they fell, and the Webway, unmaintained, its controlling civilization shattered, began to decay in sections. The portions near the Eye of Terror, where the birth of Slaanesh had torn the galaxy's warp geography apart, were completely overrun. The demonic entities that had poured into real space through that catastrophic rift also found their way into the unguarded sections of the Webway, colonizing the tunnels, making them genuinely dangerous in ways they had never been during the Aeldari Empire's height. Even sections further from the Eye were no longer safe to traverse without knowing the specific routes, without knowledge of which passages were intact and which had been claimed by things that should not be there. The Emperor had found something. Beneath the deserts of Asia on Terra, buried so deep that no human archaeological effort had ever reached it, concealed beneath geological strata that placed its origin in an era of human history that had no right to be building anything that sophisticated. There was a device from the dark age of technology, a machine of extraordinary complexity, built by minds operating at a level that the 30th millennium could not replicate. It interfaced with the Webway, not passively actively. It could be used by a psyker of sufficient power and sophistication to stabilize a portal into the Webway's network, to thread a door from the material world directly into those ancient, unimaginable corridors. To begin, carefully and methodically, the work of claiming sections of the Webway for human use. He called this device the Golden Throne, and he intended to use it in a way that its builders had almost certainly never envisioned. The plan was multi-layered, as everything the Emperor did was multi-layered. The first and most visible layer was practical. By establishing human access to the Webway, the Imperium would gain a means of travel and communication that rendered warp transit increasingly unnecessary. Worlds that were cut off by warp storms, a permanent feature of the galactic geography that would only get worse as the millennia advanced, would be reachable through the Webway when nothing else could get to them. The time and the danger of interstellar travel would be dramatically reduced. The Imperium's cohesion would be strengthened in ways that even the Astronomicon could not achieve, because the Webway offered direct connection rather than the psychic equivalent of a very loud beacon in a very dark and hostile sea. But the second layer was far more important, far more radical, far more revealing of what the Emperor actually feared and what he was actually trying to accomplish. He wanted to sever humanity from the warp, completely, not merely provide an alternative, not simply reduce reliance on warp travel as a practical matter. He wanted a future in which human civilization had no structural relationship with the Imperium at all. No warp drives threading their ships through the currents of a dimension that was fundamentally hostile to everything that breathed. No navigators required to see through a psychic medium that looked directly into the worst of what the warp contained. No astropaths projecting their minds into the Imperium to send messages, their sanity ground away by decades of exposure to something that was never designed for human contact. No golden throne, because once the webway was complete and humanity had fully transitioned to it, the throne's secondary function as a life support machine would be rendered unnecessary by the absence of the original catastrophe that required it. Humanity in the warp-independent future that the Emperor envisioned would be safe in a way that went far deeper than military safety, far deeper than the protection offered by space marines and planetary defenses and the psychic might of sanctioned psychers. They would be safe in the structural sense. The specific vulnerability that every single problem in the 40th millennium exploited the fact that humanity was embedded in a dimension that the Chaos Gods had colonized and that demonic entities could use as a vector to reach. Any psychically exposed human mind would simply no longer exist. The vulnerability would be removed, not overcome, removed. Think about what this means for the four great powers of chaos. The Chaos Gods feed on humanity. More precisely, they feed on the psychic resonance of human emotion that flows through the warp, the rage that finds Khorne, the ambition and scheming that finds Tsiench, the despair and decay that finds Nurgle, the pleasure and excess that finds Slaanesh. This is not a metaphor, it is a physical transaction in the mechanics of the setting. Human emotion generates psychic energy. That psychic energy flows into the warp. The Chaos Gods are made of it, sustained by it, empowered by it. They are, in the most literal sense, made from us. Remove the connection between humanity and the warp, and the Chaos Gods do not die nothing so simple or final. But they starve. They become less. The vast flood of human psychic resonance that makes them cosmically powerful becomes a trickle, and then nothing. As humanity moves its civilization into a dimension they cannot easily reach, and severs the pipeline that has been flowing into them since before recorded human history. You cannot defeat the Chaos Gods by matching their power. No army is that large, no psyker is that strong. The Emperor knew this better than anyone. He had been alive when those entities were forming, had watched them grow from the accumulated weight of civilizational history into beings capable of corrupting the physical laws of reality within their spheres of influence. Matching them in direct combat was not the answer. The answer was making the combat unnecessary, making humanity irrelevant to their hunger by moving it somewhere they could not easily follow. This is what the Webway Project reveals about the Emperor's deepest fear, not chaos as an enemy to be fought militarily. He had Primarchs and legions for that, and they were doing that job. What he feared, the thing that drove him off the battlefield and into a laboratory beneath a desert, was the possibility of a permanent future. A future in which the structural connection between humanity and the warp was never severed, in which the warp remained a permanent part of humanity's life and travel and psychic experience forever, in which the Chaos Gods would always have access to the fuel that made them powerful. He could win 1,000 battles in that future and still lose the war, because the war was not the Great Crusade. The war was the Deep War, the war for humanity's long-term survival in a galaxy where they had a fundamental vulnerability built into their very relationship with space travel and psychic existence. And that war could only be won by changing the terms on which it was being fought. Then Magnus the Red destroyed the project. The story of what happened is simultaneously one of the saddest and most frustrating narratives in the entire Horus heresy. Magnus, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, perhaps the most gifted natural psyker among all the Emperor's sons, brilliant and arrogant and deeply devoted to his father in his own complicated way, discovered that Horus had been corrupted. He witnessed the early stages of the conspiracy that would become the heresy and understood what it meant. and in his desperation to warn the Emperor, he did the thing he had been told not to do. He used the most powerful psychic sending anyone had ever attempted, a vast, galaxy-spanning working of forbidden magic that drove his consciousness across the Imperium directly to the Emperor's presence deep within the Imperial Palace. The warning was real. The danger he perceived was genuine. The intent behind his action was, in its own desperate way, loyal. But the method of delivery was the catastrophe. The psychic backlash of Magnus's sending crashed through the warp wards the Emperor had spent years weaving through the webway's tunnels. It found the weakest points, the newest sections, the places where the Emperor's work was most delicate and most dependent on maintained psychic integrity, and it shattered them. The warp rifts that Magnus's working created within the webway allowed thousands of demonic entities to pour through into spaces that had been carefully secured. The custodians who had been stationed there, warriors who had fought in those dark corridors for months without knowing what they were actually defending, only knowing that the Emperor himself had deemed it worth dying for, suddenly faced a demonic incursion that they had no prepared defenses against. The Emperor was forced to the throne, not as part of his plan, not because he had foreseen this contingency and prepared for it, because the alternative, stepping away from the Golden Throne while demons poured through the webway breach, would mean allowing those entities into the physical corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, into the heart of Terra itself. He had to pour his psychic power into maintaining the remaining wards, keeping the breach from expanding, preventing the project's failure from becoming an existential crisis for the entire Imperium, rather than merely a catastrophic setback. The machine that was supposed to be his tool for building humanity's future became his prison, and it has held him there ever since, locked to the work of containment rather than the work of construction, preventing a catastrophe rather than building a deliverance. What the Emperor feared is written clearly in what the Webway project was trying to accomplish. He feared permanence. He feared a future in which the current situation, humanity's dependence on the warp, the Chaos God's access to human psychic life, the constant grinding attrition of a species trying to survive in a medium that was actively hostile to it, became locked in, fixed, beyond the reach of any plan, however well constructed, to change. That fear was justified. The Webway project was the exit, and when it failed, the exit closed. What came after the Horus Heresy, the throne, the 10,000 years of managed decline, is what happens when the exit closes, and you have to figure out how to survive within the walls. Section 5. Becoming the Dark King, the Emperor's fear of himself. There is a moment in the closing chapters of the Horus Heresy, specifically in the catastrophic final hours aboard the War Master's flagship, the vengeful spirit that does not receive the attention it deserves in most discussions of the Emperor's story. It is a moment that is, when you sit with it properly, more frightening than almost anything else in the entire setting. Not frightening in the way that a demonic incursion, or a chaos space marine, or a hive fleet is frightening. Frightening in the intimate, internal, deeply personal way that the Emperor's own story consistently is. He nearly became a chaos god, not in a metaphorical sense, not in the sense that his power rivaled the gods of chaos, or that he was developing an influence comparable to theirs. In the literal, mechanistic, lore-specific sense of what it means for an entity of sufficient psychic magnitude to draw on the Immaterium's energy with sufficient depth and sustained intention that they begin to crystallize to form a parchous, self-sustaining warp presence that is not merely an extension of their consciousness, but a new entity in its own right, one fed by the fear and hope and worship of the beings who look to it, one that is defined by those projections, rather than by the original consciousness that seeded its formation. The fourth Chaos God, Slanesh, was born from the accumulated excess of Aeldari civilization over millions of years. That birth consumed the majority of the Aeldari Empire in an instant. The scale of the event was proportional to what it had been building from. The entity that emerged from the collected psychic residue of a galaxy-spanning civilization's millennia of experience was enormous, almost incomprehensibly powerful. The Emperor, by the time of the Siege of Terra, had been the focus of humanity's hope and prayers and desperate devotion for the entire length of the Great Crusade and beyond. Not millions of years, decades, but decades in which a species of trillions had directed their collective psychic energy toward a single, immensely powerful focal point. The accumulated pressure of that directed belief, building in the warp around his presence, had been one of the things he had most feared about the ecclesiarchal tendencies he had tried to suppress. And on the vengeful spirit, in the final impossibly high-stakes confrontation with Horus, he began consciously, deliberately, because he saw no other way to reach into it. The battle had gone badly, not because the Emperor lacked raw psychic power. His individual psychic capacity was essentially unmatched in the galaxy. But Horus, in his corruption, had been gifted something beyond what any individual could match: the combined power of all four chaos gods simultaneously flowing through him as a conduit: Khorne's fury, Tzeentch's sorcery, Nurgle's resilience and corruption, Slaaneish's overwhelming sensory assault, all four, simultaneously, through the being who had once been the Emperor's most trusted general and the finest military mind in human history. The combination was not merely additive. It was a siege weapon shaped like a person. The Emperor found himself losing, and the entity that had been building in the warp around him, the proto-god that human belief had been feeding for decades, the thing the lore calls the Dark King, was available, was ready, was there, in the Imperium, offering power on a scale that could match even the combined might of the Chaos Gods, because it was constituted from the same basic material, the faith of billions, just directed toward order rather than ruin. He reached for it, he began to draw on it, and in doing so, he began to become it. What the lore describes in the texts that cover these final moments is, in its way, one of the most tragic things in the entire setting. The Emperor drawing on the power of the Dark King was not a descent into corruption in the way that Horus's fall was a descent into corruption. There was no deception involved, no subtle manipulation, no chaos magic twisting his perceptions. He did it with full awareness of what it meant. He did it because he calculated that it was necessary, that without this power, he would lose, and Horus would win, and the consequences of that would be worse than what he was choosing. But he also knew what he was choosing. He had spent 50,000 years trying to prevent this exact thing from happening. He had fought against the deification of himself, suppressed the religious impulse, enforced the secular imperial truth with a rigidity that some of his sons found genuinely disturbing, all of it aimed, at some level, at preventing the accumulation of directed human belief from reaching the critical mass that would turn him into something he did not want to be. And now, at the worst possible moment, with everything he had ever worked toward at stake, he was the one reaching for it, not because he had been deceived, because he had calculated that he had no other choice. He was stopped, according to one of the most moving moments in the entire Horus Heresy book series, by an encounter with Olanius Person, a being who had been his companion since before recorded history, another perpetual who had known him longer than almost anyone. Person, somehow present in that impossible space, convinced the Emperor to release what he had been drawing on, to face Horus with what he actually was, rather than with what he was in the process of becoming. To gamble, genuinely gamble, with uncertain outcome, on the premise that becoming the Dark King was a worse version of winning than losing the fight against Horus. The Emperor released the power. The entity that had been forming in the warp around him, that crystallized concentration of human belief and hope and devotion, dissipated. And in releasing it, he shed something. The lore is specific about what he lost, the last fragment of his soul that contained compassion. Read that again. The Emperor chose not to become a god, not to consume the dark power available to him. And, in making that choice, in the specific act of releasing what he had accumulated, he lost his capacity for compassion, the ability to care, in the warm, personal, genuinely human way, for the individuals, and not merely the species. The part of him that was a father rather than an architect. The part that could look at a Primarch he had created and feel something for that specific person rather than calculating their usefulness to the project. He went into the final battle with Horus with this coldness at his core. He fought without the emotional investment that had, in its presence, made him more than a strategist. And he won in the only way the Emperor could win that fight, not through matching force with force, but through the most precise possible psychic surgery. burning away the chaos corruption that had overlaid Horus's original self with something utterly hostile to it, reaching past the dark power to find the human being underneath and destroying that corruption directly. Horus died. The Emperor was broken so thoroughly that even his perpetual nature could not simply reset and rebuild. The Golden Throne holds the ruins of what he was, sustaining his mind and his psychic beacon, while his body decays slowly toward a final death that has been 10,000 years in arriving. The fear of himself, the fear of what he would become if he reached for the power that the prayers of 1 trillion believers had deposited in the warp around his presence, was justified. He had been right to fear it. And the cost of being right was the thing he had always been afraid of losing. The compassion that made the choice to protect humanity something more than strategic calculation. Section 6. Stagnation and Religion. The Imperium he never wanted. The 41st millennium is, by almost any measure anyone inside or outside the setting applies, a horror. This is not a controversial observation. The lore itself is quite clear on it. The books, the codexes, the narrative supplements, even the most propaganda-saturated in-universe texts acknowledge, beneath the triumphant surface, that the Imperium of man in its current state is a civilization in managed decline, maintaining the forms of function while the substance beneath them slowly deteriorates. The Emperor wanted a civilization built on reason, one that solved its problems through the application of science and engineering and disciplined inquiry to discoverable facts, one that treated human beings as ends in themselves rather than resources to be spent in the maintenance of power, one that looked at the unknown and reached toward it with the confidence that understanding was possible, that the universe operated according to principles that could be discovered and used, that the future was something to be built toward rather than something to be endured. What he got was the ecclesiarchy, the imperial cult, the galaxy-spanning state religion that worships the emperor as a literal god, that builds vast cathedrals on every inhabited world, that conducts inquisitions against heresy and burns unbelievers with the specific, concentrated fury that only truly sincere religious conviction can produce is, from the emperor's original perspective, one of the most comprehensive failures imaginable. The irony is precise and almost unbearable. The Primarch Lorgar, who was punished more harshly than almost any other of the emperor's sons for his devotion, whose city was leveled and whose people were humiliated as a lesson about the toxicity of religious worship directed at the Emperor Lorgar, ultimately won. After the heresy, his Lectitio Divinitatis, the religious text that proclaimed the emperor's divinity and outlined the principles of what would become the imperial cult, became the foundational document of the Imperium's official state. Religion, the civilization that the emperor built, sustained by his sacrifice and his psychic beacon, became the civilization that worshipped him as the god emperor. The specific thing he had spent the most effort trying to prevent became the organizing principle of everything he had made, and he, trapped on the throne, could do nothing about it. Consider the Adeptus Mechanicus. The tech priests of Mars are, in theory, the preservers and developers of humanity's technological knowledge. In practice, they are the custodians of a tradition that has calcified so thoroughly that most of what they do is ritual rather than engineering. The knowledge of why the machines work, the underlying scientific principles, the physics, the actual theory, has been largely lost across 10 millennia of institutional ossification. What remains is procedure, liturgy, sacred rites of maintenance performed by artisans who know the steps but not the reasons. If a rite works, it is correct. If it does not, the priest was impure. The machine's spirit is displeased. The ritual must be performed again, or differently, or with greater devotion. This is sympathetic magic, wearing the outer shell of technology. The emperor, who had lived through the dark age of technology and understood what human engineering at its height was actually capable of ships that traveled between stars in days, artificial intelligences that managed entire civilizations, medical technologies that could heal injuries that the 41st millennium accepts as permanent, weapons that make even the most advanced current imperial armaments look primitive by comparison, would look at the Adeptus Mechanicus and recognize in it the precise pattern he had observed countless times in the decline of civilizations. Knowledge becoming doctrine, understanding becoming ritual, the living thing hardening into the fossil of itself. The bolter has not meaningfully changed in 10,000 years. The Lehman Russ tank that rolls through rubble in the 41st millennium is virtually identical to the one that rolled through rubble before the Horus Heresy. The technology exists as a fixed point rather than a platform for development. Nothing new is added. Things are occasionally lost and mourned. The best that can be hoped for is maintenance of the current level of capability. And even that maintenance is imperfect. The slow, grinding attrition of knowledge and capability is a background constant of the Imperium. The way that organizations that do not actively work to grow almost inevitably slowly shrink. The Emperor understood what stagnation did to a civilization across long time periods. He had watched it happen to empires that had seemed, at their height, permanent. Civilizations that had solved the problems of their era, that had achieved a kind of stability that felt like success, that had then made the fateful choice, sometimes a specific choice, more often just the accumulation of 1,000 smaller choices to defend that stability rather than continue the growth that had produced it, to preserve what existed rather than risk it in the pursuit of what could exist, and then, slowly, to forget that the pursuit had ever been the point. There is something almost unbearably painful about the image the lore presents of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, in whatever form consciousness persists, in a mind that has been fighting a rearguard action for 10,000 years, with no respite and no relief. This being, who spent his entire existence trying to prevent humanity from falling into exactly this pattern, imprisoned in the artifact that most perfectly symbolizes that failure. Kept alive by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, human beings with psychic gifts, the specific kind of people he had intended to shepherd through a careful, guided development into the full expression of humanity's potential, their lives burned as fuel for a beacon that guides ships through the warp that he had tried to make unnecessary. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch who was resurrected in the closing years of the 41st millennium to serve as Lord Commander, stood before the Golden Throne and communed with what remained of his father. And what he found disturbed him profoundly. Not the power, the magnitude of the Emperor's psychic presence was as vast as ever, perhaps more so, given 10,000 years of accumulated belief feeding what existed in the warp around the throne. What disturbed him was the coldness of it. The Emperor, engaged with his returned son, not with the warmth of a parent who has found a child they feared lost forever, but with the detached attention of a craftsman examining a tool he had not seen in some time and is assessing for continued usefulness. Guilliman feared that millennia of suffering had stripped away whatever warmth in humanity had once been there. What Guilliman may not have known was that the Emperor had warned his custodians of this possibility before the heresy even reached its conclusion. He had said, to the shock of those who heard it, that he did not know how to save humanity, that the Imperium was doomed, not necessarily immediately, not necessarily in any particular time frame, but ultimately, that he could see no path that led to the future he had envisioned, that the plan he had spent 50,000 years constructing had been broken at the most critical moment, and he was not certain it could be rebuilt from the pieces that remained. That admission is the most frightening thing in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not a daemon army, not a chaos god at full strength. The Emperor, the most capable and informed mind in human history, saying quietly to the beings he most trusted, "I don't know how to fix this." The fear of stagnation of the Imperium, becoming the tombstone on humanity's ambitions rather than the first chapter of its story, was not merely a fear of a bad outcome. It was the fear of a specific, identifiable pattern that the Emperor had watched consume civilization after civilization across 50,000 years of observation. He knew exactly what it looked like from the outside. He knew exactly how it felt from within. He knew how it progressed and how it ended. And he had built an entire civilization specifically to avoid it, with every layer of his plan designed to prevent the conditions that allowed it to take hold. And yet, Section 7. The Tyranids and something worse than chaos. There is a strand of the lore that sits at the periphery of most discussions about the Emperor's concerns, and it touches on something that is not from the warp, not from the internal history of the galaxy's civilizations, and not from any of the familiar categories of threat that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years developing responses to. The Tyranids arrived. They came from outside the Milky Way galaxy. From the intergalactic void, the near absolute darkness between galaxies, a space so empty and so cold that travel across it should be, by any reasonable assessment of biology and physics, completely impossible for any organic species. The distances involved are millions of light years of unimaginable nothing. No stars, no gas clouds, no gravitational reference points. Just void so complete that even the warp is thin and quiet there, lacking the psychic resonance of inhabited systems that gives it its most dangerous character. The Tyranids crossed this void. They entered a state of frozen hibernation for the crossing, their individual organisms reduced to barely functioning biological machinery, while the hive mind maintained the minimum connections needed to keep the fleet coherent across the dimensional distances involved. And they emerged into the eastern fringes of the Milky Way galaxy in earnest during the 41st millennium, though some inquisitorial records, kept far from official scrutiny, suggest that early contact and classification of bizarre xenobiological specimens may have occurred as far back as the 35th millennium, dismissed as anomalies and filed away by officials who did not understand what they were looking at. What the Tyranids are, at their most fundamental level, is consumption given physical form, not a metaphor for consumption, not a culture with consumption as its highest aspiration, the way some human empires could be described in those terms. Literal, total, absolute consumption of every organic molecule on every world they reach, stripped to the last protein, processed, recycled, and converted into more Tyranid biomass for the next wave of the invasion. Nothing is left. The worlds the hive fleets finish with are dead rocks in space, stripped of their atmospheres, their seas evaporated, their soils rendered sterile, dead in a way that feels almost surgical in its thoroughness. They are drawn to psychic beacons. This is a critical detail that connects the Tyranid threat directly back to the Emperor and the choices he made about the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon that the Emperor maintains from the Golden Throne, a signal of extraordinary psychic magnitude that blazes through the warp like a lighthouse in the dark, allowing ships with navigators to find their bearings during warp travel and maintain course across the vast distances of interstellar space. It is the thread that holds the Imperium together logistically. Without it, warp navigation would become so unreliable as to make coordinated civilization, effectively impossible. Individual worlds would still survive, but the ability to move people and goods and armies between them in any consistent, predictable way would collapse. The Astronomicon is also, from a different perspective, the loudest signal in the local galactic neighborhood, a psychic pulse of extraordinary power, broadcasting from the most psychically rich galaxy in the local group. And the Tyranids, whose hive mind is itself a vast and alien collective psychic entity, noticed it, were drawn to it, followed it across the intergalactic void to its source. The Emperor built the Astronomicon to help humanity survive. The Astronomicon may have told something from beyond the rim where to look for its next meal. But the most unsettling thread in the Tyranid lore is not what they are or what they want. It is the question that the narrative raises without fully answering. What are they running from? Because the hive fleets that have entered the galaxy, including Behemoth, which was broken at Macragge with catastrophic losses on both sides, and Kraken, which splintered and struck in 100 directions simultaneously, and Leviathan, which attacked from below the galactic plane in a demonstration of tactical sophistication that made even hardened Imperial commanders reconsider their assumptions about Tyranid intelligence these represent. According to the best analysis available to Ordo-Xeno scholars within the Imperium, a fraction of what exists beyond the galactic rim, the numbers do not add up to a total invasion. They add up to probes, scouting actions, initial contact made by the advance elements of something much larger that is still, by the most frightening calculations, not yet fully here. If the hive mind committed everything it had to crossing the intergalactic void, something motivated it. Evolution does not produce the capacity to cross millions of light-years of empty space unless crossing millions of light-years of empty space was necessary for survival. You do not burn that kind of resource, the frozen hibernation of your entire fleet, the total commitment of your biomass processing capacity to sustaining a crossing that must have consumed enormous biological reserves, unless the alternative was worse. something in the void between galaxies, and this is clearly labeled as inference and speculation within the lore itself, not established fact, was worse. Or something in the Tyranids' home territory drove them out. Or both. Or, the truth is more complicated than either. The lore does not resolve this, and that ambiguity is itself a form of information. It tells us that the writers understand what they are gesturing at is something that is scarier in its indefinition than it would be if named and explained. The Emperor, sitting on the golden throne for 10,000 years, his vast psychic presence scanning the warp and the material universe both, has had more time than anyone alive to consider what exists beyond the galactic rim. What he knows is not accessible to anyone below the very highest levels of the custodian's confidence. What he fears about it, if he fears it, is not recorded in any text that the Inquisition has allowed to survive. But the combination of the Tyranid threat and its possible implications for what lies beyond the galaxy is relevant to the Emperor's fear. Not because it is the primary fear, it is probably not, but because it adds a layer to the urgency that drove his plans. He was not merely preparing humanity for the threats he could see within the galaxy. He was preparing it, perhaps, for the possibility that the galaxy's threats were the lesser problem. That the real challenge lay in what would happen after humanity had survived everything it currently faced, when it encountered whatever else existed in a universe that is genuinely, cosmically indifferent to the survival of any individual species. A humanity that had followed his plan, that had made it through the psychic bottleneck, that was established in the webway, that was evolving toward a fully psychic civilization with understood and controlled relationships to the Imperium, that was scientifically advancing rather than ritually stagnating, was a humanity with the tools to face whatever that might be. A humanity that had instead crystallized into the Imperium of the 41st millennium, brilliant in some respects, extraordinary in others, but fundamentally frozen in the patterns that the Horus Heresy left it with was not. Section 8. The Star Child and the Fifth God Problem. Here is a question that the lore raises in its quieter moments, periodically returning to it as the metaplot slowly advances across editions and novels. What happens to the Emperor when the Golden Throne finally fails? Not if. The lore is clear on this point, even when individual characters within the setting prefer not to think about it. The Golden Throne is failing. Not rapidly, not in any time frame that most Imperial citizens will live to see, but failing nonetheless. The Adeptus Mechanicus, for all their reverence for it as the holiest machine in the Imperium, the sacred object at the center of their theology, the ultimate expression of the union between technology and divine purpose, do not understand it well enough to repair it. They can maintain what works, they cannot restore what is broken, and things have been breaking, slowly, for 10,000 years. The senior Archmagos, who have studied it most carefully, do not speak publicly about what their models suggest. But the trend is clear to anyone with access to the data and the willingness to follow it to its conclusion. When the throne finally fails, what happens depends enormously on which theory you find most credible, which sources you weight, and how much you trust the most ancient and obscure strands of the lore versus the more recent canonical developments. The Eldar, who understand the warp at a depth that even the most gifted human psychers rarely approach, whose civilization's history with psychic power and its consequences is millions of years longer than humanity's hold. A position on this question that they express with a directness that most humans find uncomfortable. They believe that the Emperor's death would create a new Eye of Terror, centered on Terra. Not merely a large warp rift. The galaxy already has plenty of those. They mean the specific, catastrophic category of event that occurred when Slaanesh was born from the fall of the Eldari, a wound in reality so large and so deep that it permanently alters the warp geography of the surrounding region, remains open indefinitely, and serves as a permanent point of ingress for demonic entities into the material universe. And they believe it would create a new chaos god. 10,000 years of sustained worship from trillions of humans, the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers pouring their life energy into the Emperor's psychic presence, the continuous prayer of an entire civilization directed, with a devotion that only millennia of institutional reinforcement can produce, toward a single focal point of immense psychic power. The accumulated emotional weight of every Imperial citizen who ever died with his name on their lips, and in the 41st millennium. That number is unimaginably large, pressing against the warp presence of the entity at its center. The Emperor is currently the largest single accumulation of directed human belief in the history of the galaxy. When that accumulation is released, not in a controlled, intentional way, as part of a plan, but catastrophically, because the machine holding it together finally fails, the entity that emerges on the other side of that release will be something the galaxy has never encountered. Not a dark reflection of human vice like the existing 4 chaos gods. Something that carries the shape of human hope and devotion in the same way that corn carries the shape of human rage. Something defined by what billions of believers prayed at in the dark. Something that is, in its own way, a god born from the best of what humanity, directed toward the figure it loved most, wearing the face of salvation, and yet constituted from the same psychic substance as the powers that humanity has been fighting for 10,000 years. The Eldar do not say this to be cruel. They say it because they have seen this happen before. Their own god, Slanesh, was born from the cumulative excesses of their civilization, not from the worst of what the Eldari were, but from the extremity of what they chose to pursue. The mechanism is the same. Concentrated psychic energy, sustained over time, directed through the warp, reaching a threshold where it crystallizes into something self-sustaining. They recognize the pattern, and they watch the Emperor on the golden throne and see it building, slowly, toward the same kind of event. This is what some strands of the lore call the Star Child. Not a chaos god in the monstrous sense, something that retains, in theory, the character of what it was built from. The Emperor's version of this potential entity carries the shape of hope, of order, of the care for human flourishing that the Emperor himself embodied. But it would be a warp entity. It would be a god. And the question of whether a god of hope and order, born from human love for the Emperor, would be a friend or an enemy to what actually remained of humanity is a question that the lore deliberately leaves open. There is an old theory in the setting, originating in the earliest realm of chaos supplements and periodically resurfacing in newer canonical material, involving a secret society called the Illuminati. These are individuals who have, through some of the most extreme experiences available to humans in the 40K universe, surviving demonic possession, emerging from it, with their sanity intact, and with an immunity to chaos corruption that other humans do not possess, come to understand things about the warp and its relationship to the Emperor that most people never learn. They have studied the matter from the inside. They have access to knowledge from the Black Library, the hidden archive of the Eldari, where the most dangerous truths in the galaxy are preserved precisely because they are too dangerous for most minds to encounter. And they have been searching for the Sensei. According to the strands of lore that discuss them, the Emperor has had children, mortal children, born of relationships over his tens of thousands of years of walking among humanity. These children, or their descendants carrying in their genetics some fragment of his perpetual nature and his warp invisibility, are the Sensei. They are not perpetuals in the full sense. They will eventually age and die. But they are psychically extraordinary, and they carry something of what the Emperor was in the shape of what they are. The Illuminati's plan is this: gather the Sensei, wait for the moment of the Emperor's death, and at that moment, sacrifice the Sensei willingly, knowingly, the lives of the Emperor's own children offered as the seed crystal for what emerges from the warp when the throne fails. Use their concentrated genetic and psychic legacy, offered in sacrifice, as the mechanism that tips the balance between the Star Child being born as a god of hope that retains the Emperor's intent versus being born as a fifth chaos god wearing his face. Whether this plan could work, whether anything could work to control what happens when the throne finally fails, is a question the lore does not answer, because it has not happened yet. The narrative of the 42nd millennium, such as it exists in the most recent sources, is one of a galaxy that is moving toward something. Visions of a golden infant. Reports from the astropathic networks of a radiant figure rising from a throne of chains, forces of chaos, actively working to prevent the awakening they call the Star Child, which suggests they believe it is real, and they believe it would threaten them. The Emperor always feared becoming a god. The deepest irony of the 41st millennium is that the question is no longer whether he becomes one. It is, What kind? Section 9. Humanity's Psychic Evolution. The Race Against Extinction. There is a layer to the Emperor's plan, the most fundamental layer, the one that everything else was built to protect and enable, that most discussions of the lore treat as background context rather than the actual center of the story. But it is the center. Everything else is scaffolding around this core. What the Emperor believed humanity was in the process of becoming, and why that process was the most important thing in the galaxy. Humanity is evolving, not metaphorically, not in the casual cultural sense of the word, in the specific, biological, mechanistic sense. The proportion of humans born with psychic sensitivity has been increasing since at least the 30th millennium, and in the 41st, it is increasing faster than ever. More psychers are born with each passing generation. The change is measurable. The trend is unmistakable. It has been recognized and studied by the most capable Imperial scholars, and the data, for anyone willing to follow it, past the point where the implications become uncomfortable, points in a direction that is simultaneously the most hopeful and the most terrifying thing in the setting. Humanity is becoming a psychic species. The Emperor understood this process because he had been alive when it began. He had watched the earliest expression of psychic sensitivity in humans, those Neolithic shamans whose collective sacrifice had created him as the first generation of something new. Not a random mutation, not a freakish aberration from the normal pattern of human biology, but the first hesitant expression of a direction that the species was moving in, the long arc of human psychic development. The slow, generational emergence of abilities that would eventually, across millennia of continued development, produce something genuinely different from the biological humans of the current era. He understood the shape of this arc better than anyone alive, because he had been watching it from the very beginning, and he understood something about it that most of the Imperium scholars and officials who encounter the data without the full context do not. This process is not optional. It cannot be stopped. Suppressing psychic ability in individual humans, collecting them on the black ships, training and sanctioning the ones who can be controlled, destroying the ones who cannot, does not stop the emergence. It manages the current population. The genetics that produce psychic sensitivity continue to propagate and to express themselves with increasing frequency in new generations, regardless of what happens to individuals who are already born. The black ships are not a solution. They are a dam against a river that is getting wider with every decade. This is, in raw terms, a crisis. But it is also, from the Emperor's perspective, an opportunity, the specific opportunity he had been preparing for since before the Age of Strife. A fully psychic humanity, in the scenario the Emperor envisioned, is not a vulnerability, it is an ascendancy. A species with genuine, widespread, understood psychic ability, with the training and the institutional knowledge and the cultural frameworks to make that ability a tool rather than a weakness, would have a relationship with the warp and the entities within it that is categorically different from the current one. Not prey, something else. Something that the Chaos Gods, who are currently supremely confident in their ability to exploit human psychic sensitivity, would find much more difficult to simply consume. But getting from here to there, from a species in the early stages of psychic emergence, massively vulnerable at precisely the moment when that vulnerability is most acute, to a species that has worked through that vulnerability and reached the other side, requires threading an extraordinarily narrow needle. Too fast, and the emerging psychic generations overwhelm the Imperium's capacity to manage them, producing catastrophic collapses as untrained psychers tear holes between the material world and the warp in populated areas. Too slow, and the emergence continues without any coherent framework for handling it. Each generation slightly more psychic than the last, each generation slightly more exploitable by the entities of the Imperium, the pressure building without any corresponding development of the defenses needed to manage it. The Emperor's plan was the needle. The Great Crusade was about unifying humanity, as a species creating the political and institutional coherence necessary to manage the emergence with enough coordination to avoid the catastrophic scenarios on both ends. The Webway project was about removing the most dangerous vector for exploitation by giving humanity a travel network that bypassed the warp entirely, It would protect the emerging psychic population from the most acute forms of warp exposure during the most vulnerable period. The imperial truth was about preventing the wrong kind of psychic development, the kind that went through worship and fearful belief, rather than through understanding and training, the kind that fed the chaos gods rather than starving them. All of it was a framework for getting humanity through the bottleneck of its own evolution. The Horus heresy destroyed the framework at the worst possible moment. The Webway project fell. The Emperor was imprisoned on the throne. The institutions that remained were not the institutions the Emperor had designed. They were what survived a civilization-shaking civil war, reorganized by people who were themselves traumatized and working with incomplete information about what the Emperor had actually been trying to do, making decisions that were reasonable given what they knew, but devastating in light of what they did not. The psychic tide kept rising. It rose through 10,000 years of the 40th and 41st millennia, without the management framework that was supposed to be in place to handle it. The black ships collect more psychers every generation. The rate of psychic emergence continues to accelerate. The Culexus Temple, the order of assassins who weaponize the pariah gene, the specific biological variant that makes a human invisible to the warp, is one of the Emperor's oldest and most secret projects. A contingency for a scenario in which the psychic emergence was happening faster than it could be safely guided. It is a sign of how seriously he took the danger of an uncontrolled emergence that he prepared millennia ago. A weapon specifically designed to manage it if his primary plans failed. In the 42nd millennium, the current moment, such as it can be called that, in the ongoing 40K narrative, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, has torn the galaxy in two along a massive warp fault. More psychers are manifesting than at any previous point in recorded history. The warp is more turbulent than it has been since the heresy. The conditions the Emperor most feared, the psychic emergence happening too fast, without the protections he had designed, in an environment more hostile than ever to unguided psychic development, are not a future risk. They are the current reality. The race is happening. The question is whether there is anything left of the Emperor's original vision that could still guide the outcome. Section 10. The unanswerable question. What did he know that we cannot? We have spent a great deal of time walking through the specifics of what the Emperor feared and why. His fear of chaos becoming a permanent structural feature of human existence. His fear of the Imperium becoming the last thing humanity ever was, rather than the first thing it grew beyond. His fear of himself, of what he might become, and then of what he did become, at least partially, in the act of choosing not to become something worse. His fear of the psychic emergence happening without the protections he had tried to build. His fear of something at the edges of the galaxy that the lore only gestures at without naming directly. But there is a layer beneath all of these that is simultaneously the most important and the least accessible, because it concerns what the Emperor knew that he never told anyone. What a being who has lived for approximately 50,000 years, who has been present for events that no other living entity witnessed, who has the accumulated memory and wisdom and pattern recognition of the most extraordinary human mind that has ever existed. What such a being might understand about the nature of reality and the long-term trajectory of the galaxy that simply has no equivalent anywhere else. The lore scatters small hints throughout its vast body of text. Some of them are easy to miss. Some require reading across sources that were published decades apart and drawing connections that the writers may or may not have intended. But the hints are there, and taken together, they suggest something important. The Emperor knew the fall of the Aldari was coming long before it happened. The birth of Slaanesh, the psychic event that created the Eye of Terror, consumed the majority of Eldari civilization in a single terrible instant, and permanently reshaped the warped geography of the galaxy, was not a surprise to him. He had watched the Aldari civilization slow drift toward the conditions that would produce it. He had seen the pattern before in other contexts, different details and different scales, but the same underlying mechanism, a civilization whose members were extraordinarily psychically sensitive, and whose culture was drifting, generation by generation, toward the specific combination of excess and decadence that would eventually produce a catastrophic warp event. He built his plans around the fall of the Eldari as an anticipated event. The age of strife, That long period of horror and isolation that immediately preceded the Great Crusade ended in part because the birth of Slaanesh temporarily stabilized certain warp conditions that had made reliable interstellar travel functionally impossible. Warp storms that had isolated human worlds from each other for thousands of years became navigable, briefly and variably, in the aftermath of the cataclysm. The Emperor had been waiting for exactly this stabilization, had spent the years of the strife building, preparing, creating the Primarchs and the Space Marines, unifying Terra, positioning everything to move the instant the conditions were right. He knew because he had been watching the Aeldari decline for centuries. He had done the calculation, and he had incorporated the result of that calculation into his timeline with the confident precision of a mind that had been observing long enough to trust its own modeling. What else had he incorporated? What else had he seen coming that no other living being would recognize as a planned-for contingency until well after the fact? The Grey Knights are perhaps the most suggestive example. This chapter was founded in the final days of the heresy, at the Emperor's personal direction, created with requirements of psychic purity and specific psychic training that reflect exactly the kind of guided psychic development he always believed humanity needed. Every Grey Knight is a powerful psyker. Every Grey Knight's soul has been personally examined and sanctioned to a degree that far exceeds what any other organization in the Imperium applies. They are, in miniature, a demonstration of what the Emperor believed was possible. Human beings with psychic gifts, properly trained and properly guided, who are not vulnerabilities, but genuine weapons against the entities that exploit psychic ability in others. The Grey Knights are tiny in number and secret in existence. They are not the solution to the psychic emergence, but they are a proof of concept, maintained in secret for 10,000 years, a living demonstration that the Emperor's vision of what psychic humanity could be is not merely theoretical, it exists, it works. In a setting where almost nothing goes right, this one thing, small, hidden, insufficient for the scale of the problem, has been maintained as the Emperor planned. Why? For whom? For what moment? The Terminus Decree is another suggestive thread, woven through the most recent Horus Heresy novels and the current 40K metaplot in ways that suggest the writers are working toward something. The Golden Throne is not merely a life support machine. The evidence in the texts suggests it was always something else, a device with a specific intended purpose, one that the Emperor prepared but has not been able to execute from his current position. What that purpose is remains genuinely unclear, and we should be honest about that ambiguity, rather than treating one interpretation as established. But the existence of an undeployed purpose built into the most important artifact in the Imperium is a thread that repays attention. The custodians act on instructions that continue to be relevant despite the Emperor's apparent incapacity to actively communicate with the outside world. The mandate of the 10,000 extends well beyond bodyguard functions. They conduct operations, they pursue agendas, they make decisions based on a standing set of instructions that predates the heresy and has never been fully superseded. Whatever the Emperor built into the institution of the custodians before he was confined to the throne has been guiding actions for 10,000 years. A dead man's switch on civilizational scale, a set of instructions so carefully constructed that they continue to function in the absence of the consciousness that designed them. This is not a simple organizational legacy. This is the output of 50,000 years of planning being maintained across a period during which its architect is not available to supervise, which means the Emperor, when he built these contingencies, was confident enough in their design to trust them to function without him, confident in his own modeling of what would happen and what would be needed across the centuries and millennia that he correctly anticipated. He would be unable to actively guide. What did he see coming that convinced him to build this much redundancy into his plans? What does he know, locked on the throne, that the custodians are not fully told but are acting on anyway, because he was foresighted enough to embed the necessary responses into their institutional structure before he lost the ability to give new instructions? The answer, if it exists, is not something the lore currently gives us, but the question itself is one of the most compelling in the setting, because it reframes everything. If the Emperor's silence is not merely the silence of damage, if there is intent in it, calculation, the ongoing execution of a plan whose final stages require precisely the current situation, however horrifying it appears from within, then the grim darkness of the 41st millennium looks different, not better. Not less terrible in its daily reality of suffering and war and institutional cruelty and grinding entropy, but purposeful, moving towards something. Or it may simply be silence. The damage may be real, the plan may be broken, the silence may be nothing more than the quietude of a consciousness that has been fighting the same battle for 10,000 years with no relief and is running out of the resources to continue. The Emperor may have been right about what was coming, and still found it insufficient to prevent it. Being right, after all, does not guarantee the capacity to act on that rightness. The finest strategist in history can still be outmaneuvered by time and scale, and the sheer weight of everything that goes wrong at once. That tension between the Emperor as still working agent and the Emperor as barely surviving casualty is the central, unresolvable tension of the 41st millennium. The setting refuses to commit to either. It holds both possibilities simultaneously, and the horror of the situation comes precisely from that refusal to resolve. Closing. That is what it comes to, in the end. The deepest fear of the most powerful human being who ever lived was not a specific enemy, not a specific catastrophe, not the 4 dark gods or the alien hordes or the traitors among his own sons. His deepest fear was the failure of the particular, the fear that everything he had done, every sacrifice he had accepted and imposed, every plan he had constructed across 50,000 years of watching and learning and waiting might simply not be enough. That the margin for success in the most ambitious project any mind in history had ever undertaken might be narrower than even he could thread. He feared that humanity might survive the wrong way, that the species might endure technically while losing the capacity for the kind of growth that made endurance worth having. That the Imperium he built as a shield might become a cage so complete and so permanent that no one inside it could remember what it had originally been built to protect. He feared becoming the thing he had spent his existence fighting against. Not chaos. Chaos was the known enemy, the understood adversary, the terrible but comprehensible force of spiritual entropy. He feared becoming a god nourished by desperation, defined by the needs of his worshippers rather than by the 50,000 years of considered purpose that had been his actual self. And he feared, perhaps above all else and with the clearest understanding, that he was right about all of this and that being right was not enough. The Imperium of man is simultaneously humanity's greatest achievement and humanity's greatest failure. It has survived things that should have destroyed it 100 times over. It continues to exist against all rational projection, and in its survival, it has become something that the Emperor who built it would look at with something very like grief, recognizing his own work in its bones, and finding that the bones are all that remain of the living thing he intended. The question that the 42nd millennium is slowly moving toward answering, or refusing to answer, because the setting has never really been about answers, is whether the bones are enough, whether something can be built on what has survived, whether the plan, broken and battered and maintained in fragments by institutions that barely understand why they are doing what they do, still has a path forward that leads to the future the Emperor was working toward. In a setting that calls itself the grimdark, that defined a genre of deliberately oppressive science fiction, the most radical statement it has ever made is that hope exists. Not comfortable hope, not certain hope, hope that is maintained despite everything that argues against it, because the alternative, abandoning the premise that the future could be different from the present, is the thing that actually kills civilizations. Not armies, not gods, the decision to stop reaching. The Emperor reached. For 50,000 years, he reached. And he is reaching still, in whatever form that reaching takes from the Golden Throne, in the silence, that may be the silence of exhaustion, or the silence of a mind still calculating moves in a game whose board is larger than anyone watching can see. Whether he wins is a question the 41st millennium cannot answer. Whether there is a version of winning that looks like what he originally intended, almost certainly not. Too much has been lost. Too much time has passed. The specific future he planned toward is not the future that arrived, but the question of whether any future at all is still possible, whether the species he gave his existence to can find its way through everything converging on it and become something genuinely new, something that justifies the price that was paid. That question is still open. And in a setting defined by war without end, that it is still open might be the most important thing about it. If you made it all the way through genuinely, thank you. This lore goes deep, and I love that there are people willing to go there with me. If you want to keep exploring, subscribe so you do not miss the next video, and leave a comment below. What do you think the Emperor's actual endgame is? Is he still working towards something from the throne? Is the silence a plan, or is it just damage? I want to know what you think. I read every comment. See you in the next one. Extended section. The long game, 50,000 years of watching the same mistake. There is something that becomes clear when you look at the Emperor's actions across the full span of what the lore tells us about them, and it is not what most people expect. The Emperor was not, at his core, a warrior. He was a planner. A mind that had observed long enough to understand that the single most dangerous thing in any complex system is not the obvious threat, but the pattern that repeats, regardless of which specific threat is presenting itself at any given moment. Think about what 50,000 years of observation actually means in practice. A normal human life, a long one, lived in relative good health spans, perhaps 8 or 9 decades. In that time, a perceptive person might watch 1 or 2 major shifts in the political landscape of their civilization. They might live through a handful of wars. They might see cultural values shift enough to notice the change within their lifetime. They accumulate wisdom from these experiences. They learn from their mistakes and the mistakes of people around them. They develop what we call perspective, the ability to see current events in the context of a larger pattern that extends beyond the immediate moment. Now, multiply that lifespan by 600. By the time the Emperor began the Great Crusade, he had lived through approximately 600 human lifetimes of continuous experience. He had watched more civilizations rise and fall than history records. He had seen empires that seemed permanent become archaeological sites. He had watched technologies that seemed miraculous become mundane and then obsolete and then forgotten. He had seen every form of government that human beings could devise, implemented under the widest possible variety of conditions, and had tracked which ones survived under which pressures and which ones failed and in what specific ways they failed. He had learned to recognize early warning signs, the way an experienced physician recognizes the early symptoms of a disease, not from the obvious presentation, but from the subtle indicators that precede the obvious presentation by months or years. The specific cultural signals that preceded collapse, the institutional patterns that preceded tyranny, the psychic signatures that preceded catastrophic warp events, the behavioral patterns in populations that preceded the conditions in which chaos could most effectively take hold. This was his primary tool, not his psychic power, though that was extraordinary, not his physical capabilities, though those were beyond anything an ordinary human could achieve. His primary tool was pattern recognition across a time span that gave him a sample size that no other conscious being could match. And the pattern he had observed most consistently across the widest variety of civilizations and historical contexts was this: the greatest threats to any civilization are never entirely external. The enemies that come from outside the alien horde, the rival civilization, the natural catastrophe, are things that civilizations can mobilize against when they see them coming. They create the kind of shared threat that actually tends to unite rather than divide, that produces the best of what collective human effort can accomplish. The catastrophes that actually end civilizations tend to be internal, the slow drift of values, the calcification of institutions that were designed to solve specific problems and that continue to exist after those problems change, now creating new problems that they were never designed to address. The cultural patterns that become self-reinforcing regardless of whether they are still serving the purpose that created them. The tendency of power to concentrate and of concentrated power to become self-serving rather than purpose-serving. The gap between what a civilization says it values and what its actual behavior demonstrates it values, widening over generations until the words and the reality have no meaningful relationship to each other. These are the things that actually killed civilizations in the Emperor's 50,000-year sample set, not external enemies, internal inertia. Chaos exploits exactly these patterns. This is not a coincidence. The four great powers are literally constituted from the emotional residue of these failures. Corn from the rage that comes from systems that are unfair, and from the violence that unfair systems produce. Zinch from the desperate hope and scheming ambition of beings who cannot find legitimate paths to change and turn instead to manipulation and subversion. Nurgle from the despair and resignation that comes when beings accept that things cannot get better and make a kind of peace with decay. Slaanesh from the excess that inevitably follows when beings who have power use it first for pleasure and then for the specific kind of pleasure that requires increasingly extreme stimulation to produce the same effect. The Chaos Gods are not merely enemies that civilization happens to face. They are the metaphysical crystallization of civilization's failure modes. They are what the worst of what humans do looks like when it has been accumulating in the warp long enough to develop its own agency. Understanding this, truly understanding it, as the Emperor did, not as an intellectual concept, but as a visceral certainty born from watching the process happen hundreds of times under hundreds of different circumstances, changes the nature of the problem entirely. You cannot fight the Chaos Gods by defeating them militarily, not in the long term, because they are replenished by the very conditions that produce military conflict. Every war fought in rage feeds corn. Every desperate struggle for survival in the face of decay feeds Nurgle. Every tactical scheming and ambition for advancement during wartime feeds Tziench. The Chaos Gods do not lose when they lose battles. They gain from the fighting itself on both sides. The only way to genuinely diminish them is to remove the conditions that create them. To change human civilization, and eventually other civilizations, given that the Chaos Gods feed on all sentient life, not merely on humans, in ways that reduce the specific emotional residue they are constituted from, less unfairness that produces the specific kind of rage corn feeds on, less desperate scheming born of blocked legitimate paths that produces Tziench's kind of ambition, less resignation in the face of entropy that produces Nurgle's kind of despair, less excess that produces Slaanesh's particular hunger. This is, in essence, what a genuinely good and just civilization would accomplish as a natural consequence of being good and just. The Emperor's vision of a humanity guided by reason, advancing scientifically, building institutions that serve their purposes, treating individuals as ends rather than means, developing psychic ability in controlled and understood ways rather than through desperate, fearful contact with the Imperium. This vision was not merely idealistic political philosophy. It was the specific prescription that 50,000 years of observation had produced for reducing the conditions that fed the entities he was fighting. The tragedy is that building such a civilization, actually building it, not just describing it, but creating the institutional architecture and the cultural frameworks and the educational systems and the political structures that would produce and sustain it across generations, requires exactly the kind of time and stability and freedom from existential threat that the Emperor's civilization did not have. He was trying to build a peaceful, just, scientifically advancing civilization in the middle of a galaxy that was actively hostile to the existence of such a thing. The Chaos Gods were not going to wait patiently while humanity developed the cultural and institutional sophistication that would reduce their power. They would and did attack the project at every stage, finding its weakest points and exploiting them, using the very mechanisms of civilization building as vectors for the corruption that undermined it. He was trying to thread a needle while someone else was moving the fabric. This context, the context of a mind that understood the problem at this depth, that had been working on this specific challenge for longer than most civilizations exist, is what makes the Emperor's choices comprehensible, even when they seem, from a shorter perspective, bizarre or even callous. The decision to keep the Chaos Gods secret from his Primarchs, the decision to enforce the imperial truth despite knowing it was incomplete, the decision to leave the Great Crusade at a critical moment to work on the Webway project in secret. These choices look like failures of communication, or failures of trust, or failures of political judgment, and they are those things too. But they are also the choices of a being who is doing calculus on a scale that no one around him can match, making trade-offs that seem wrong in the short term, because he is optimizing for outcomes across longer timescales than his sons could perceive. He was wrong about some of the specific trade-offs. The decision to keep knowledge of chaos from the Primarchs almost certainly contributed to their vulnerability to it. Lorgar's search for gods to worship, Fulgrim's susceptibility to the daemon sword, Angron's relationship with the nails, all of these were shaped in part by an absence of context that the Emperor could have provided and chose not to. Whether providing it would have prevented the heresy is genuinely unknowable. It might have prevented some falls and caused others. The counterfactual is too complex to resolve. But the pattern of excessive secrecy, the tendency to manage information so tightly that even the beings he most needed to trust him were kept in the dark about things that directly affected them, was a genuine flaw in his approach, one that had consequences he could not fully calculate even with 50,000 years of experience to draw on. The failure mode he most tried to avoid in civilization was also one of his own most persistent failure modes as a leader. He understood, intellectually, the importance of distributed understanding of a civilization in which the knowledge of why things were done was spread widely enough that it did not all depend on a single point of understanding. And yet he consistently made choices that concentrated understanding at the single point that he constituted, keeping everyone else dependent on trusting him without the information needed to evaluate whether that trust was warranted. This is perhaps the most human thing about him. The mind sophisticated enough to understand the pattern in everyone else was not sophisticated enough to fully exempt itself from the pattern. The being who had watched civilizations fail through over-centralization built his own civilization with himself as an unreplaceable center point. The being who understood that secrecy, enabled the conditions that fed chaos, kept secrets in ways that enabled exactly those conditions. He was right about the destination. The map he drew toward it was imperfect. And in the gap between the rightness of the destination and the imperfection of the map, the Horus heresy found its room to exist. Extended section. The 1,000 years before the Crusade, what he was building in the dark, the period between the end of the Age of Strife and the beginning of the Great Crusade, is one of the most underexplored in the lore, and what examination reveals there is quietly extraordinary. Because the Emperor did not begin his public project the moment conditions allowed it, he began building his public project long before the world knew it was happening. When the warp storms that had isolated Terra and the nearby systems finally calmed the calming that the Emperor had anticipated, that the birth of Slaanesh produced as a side effect of consuming the psychic energy that had been maintaining the storms, he was not starting from nothing. He had been using the preceding centuries of isolation, the time when Terra was cut off from the stars and fighting itself in the desperate wars of the Age of Strife, to prepare, quietly, in ways that required decades and sometimes centuries to produce results, but that he knew, from his modeling of the situation, would be necessary before the first ship left orbit. He created the Thunder Warriors, these massive gene-enhanced soldiers, cruder than the Space Marines, who would eventually replace them, more brutal, engineered for the specific violence of ground warfare on a ruined planet, rather than for the sustained campaigns of interstellar conquest, were his tool for unifying Terra. He used them. They were extraordinary soldiers, and he deployed them with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how much violence was necessary, and exactly what kind of violence served the purpose versus what kind would create new problems. And then he ended them. The Thunder Warriors who had unified Terra were phased out, many of them culled not for pleasure, not from cruelty, but from the same calculating logic that had created them. They were built for a specific purpose. That purpose was complete. Their biological engineering made them too unstable for long-term existence, their augmentations producing psychological profiles that would become increasingly problematic over time. Keeping them would have been a strategic error. Ending them was a strategic calculation. This pattern, create the tool, use the tool, end the tool when its use is done, recurs through everything the Emperor did. And it is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his character when examined closely. The Thunder Warriors. Eventually, the Space Marine legions themselves, Malkador claimed, in a statement that may or may not have been accurate, that the Emperor had always intended the legions to be disbanded after the Great Crusade. with mortal humans as the true inheritors of the Imperium. Whether this was genuine or not, it reflects the same instrumental logic. You build what you need for the current phase of the plan, you use it for its intended purpose, and then you prepare for the phase that follows. The problem with this approach, as the Horus Heresy made clear, is that the tools are people, and people do not simply accept being decommissioned once they have served their purpose. The Thunder Warriors who survived their intended end and were hunted down the Space Marines, who were told that their service would eventually not be needed, these beings had not been designed to simply fade away once the Emperor's plan moved to its next phase. They had been designed to be extraordinary, and extraordinary beings do not typically accept obsolescence with grace. The Primarchs, most of all, were not tools in the simple sense that the Thunder Warriors were tools. They were more than that, more capable, more conscious, more individually realized, more emotionally invested in the relationship with their father that they believed they had, and that the Emperor, in his coldest moments, may have regarded primarily in instrumental terms. The possibility never confirmed, but suggested by the most damning readings of the available lore, that the Emperor created beings with the full depth of personhood and then related to them primarily in terms of what they could accomplish for his project is one of the most morally challenging aspects of his character. He may have been right about the plan. The plan may have been the only viable path to a future worth having, and it may still have been a form of profound injustice toward the specific beings who were created to serve it. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. That is, in fact, the Emperor's character in its most complete form, a being who may have been more right about the nature of the problem than any other consciousness in history, who designed and executed a response of extraordinary sophistication and ambition, and who in doing so made choices about specific persons that sit very uneasily against any reasonable ethical framework. Right about the big picture, not obviously right about the small ones. And in a universe where every strategic calculation is ultimately constituted from the lives of actual beings, the gap between those two things is not small at all. Extended section. What the silence on the throne might mean. The Emperor has been on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. In that time, he has communicated directly with the outside world on only a handful of occasions that the lore documents, and each of those occasions is illuminating in its own way. Not so much for what he said, but for what each communication reveals about what he is doing, what he is thinking, what remains of his original self in the conditions of his current existence. Guilliman's conversation with him in the late 41st millennium, the one where Guilliman felt only coldness and detachment, where he was received as a craftsman, receives a tool rather than a father. A son is the most significant because Guilliman was perhaps the Primarch with the most capacity to make an accurate assessment of what he found. Guilliman is, within the lore, a being of extraordinary administrative and intellectual capacity, clear-eyed and analytical, not given to mysticism or wishful thinking. When he says that he felt no warmth in his father, when he says that what he found disturbed him profoundly, this is not the assessment of someone prone to misreading social situations. It is the considered judgment of one of the most capable minds in the Imperium. And yet, the Emperor did communicate. The communication was precise. The content was not the rambling of a damaged consciousness or the repetitive noise of a mind that has lost its coherence. It was the communication of something that still had purposes, still had assessments, still had things it wanted its interlocutor to do or understand. Damaged, yes. Cold, yes. Stripped of the warmth that made the relationship between father and son something more than a transaction, yes. But not incoherent, not empty. Not simply the biological persistence of a consciousness that has lost its organizing purpose. Something is still working. Something is still there. The custodians continue to receive what functions as instruction from the throne, not in any form that is clearly described as direct communication. The Emperor does not sit on the throne issuing orders through a Vox unit, but the institutions he built continue to act in ways that reflect ongoing purpose, that suggest the existence of at least some residual guiding intelligence behind the choices being made. The decisions about which situations warrant custodian intervention, the choices about what information is suppressed and what is allowed to reach the High Lords of Terra, the tolerance of certain heresies and the extirpation of others, in patterns that make more sense if there is a mind still making distinctions than if everything is merely proceeding on institutional autopilot. What if the silence is the plan? What if the Emperor, in those last clear moments before the throne became his permanent situation, calculated that the greatest gift he could give to the Imperium, the thing most likely to produce a viable path to the future he had always been working toward, was precisely his absence from active leadership? Not his death, which would be catastrophic for reasons already discussed, but his silence, his apparent inactivity. The state that forces the Imperium to function without active guidance, to develop its own solutions to its own problems, to face the consequences of its own choices, without the option of appealing to an authority that will fix everything. Paternalistic control, maintained indefinitely, is the specific institutional pattern that most reliably produces the kind of infantilized, dependent civilization that cannot manage its own evolution. The Emperor understood this. He had watched civilizations that became too dependent on the genius of individual leaders and that collapsed catastrophically when those leaders were gone, not because the leaders were wrong about their importance in the short term, but because their continuous intervention had prevented the development of the distributed capacity that would have made them unnecessary in the long term. Is the Golden Throne a choice as much as a consequence? Is the Emperor's silence punctuated by the very occasional direct communication that confirms he is still there and still functional? A deliberate strategy for forcing the Imperium to grow up? For creating the conditions in which humanity has to figure things out for itself, has to develop its own leadership and its own solutions and its own path forward, because the alternative of waiting for the Emperor to fix everything is not available? This reading is speculative. It is one interpretation among several possible ones, and it should be labeled clearly as such. But it is also not inconsistent with what the lore shows us about how the Emperor operated across 50,000 years. He was willing to let things be painful in the short term for what he calculated were better long-term outcomes. He was willing to maintain strategies across timescales that made the short-term costs seem incomprehensible. He had patience that exceeded anything most beings could sustain. 10,000 years on the throne is not too long for a being who had already spent 50,000 years working toward this outcome. It is painful, it is terrible. It is not consistent with any reasonable definition of well-being, but it may be consistent with continuing to work toward the only goal that the Emperor has ever actually had, a future in which humanity can sustain itself without him. That is the final and deepest layer of what he feared. Not chaos, not stagnation, not deification, not even the catastrophic warp event that his death might produce. He feared that he would be necessary forever, that the species he had devoted his existence to protecting would never develop the capacity to protect itself, that the future he was working toward one in which humanity was genuinely capable, genuinely mature, genuinely able to face the galaxy without requiring an immortal guardian to stand between it and everything that wanted to consume it was not actually achievable, that the need for him would never go away, that the plan whose endpoint was his own irrelevance would never reach its endpoint. He feared being indispensable permanently, because an indispensable guardian is also, inevitably, an indispensable constraint, and a species that cannot exist without its guardian has not, in any meaningful sense, grown up. The Imperium of Man is the largest and most complex civilization in human history. It spans 1,000,000 worlds. It encompasses trillions of individuals, each living their entire life within a framework that was built before their ancestors' ancestors were born, that they did not choose, that does not ask for their consent, that will continue with or without them, and will grind on long after they are gone. It is simultaneously an extraordinary achievement and an extraordinary failure. It has survived things that should have destroyed it and been damaged by things that should have been manageable. It contains within it the seeds of the future the Emperor wanted and the patterns of the future he feared. Both are there. Both are real. Which one wins is the question that the current era of the lore is slowly, carefully, ambiguously beginning to approach an answer to. Not a clean answer, not a resolution that wraps things up. Something more like a turning point, a moment when the direction becomes clearer, without the destination becoming certain. The Emperor sits on the throne. The galaxy burns around him, And somewhere in the silence of a mind that has been thinking for 50,000 years and shows no particular sign of stopping, the calculation continues. Whether it reaches a solution before the machine that sustains it finally fails is the most important question in Warhammer 40,000. And we do not know the answer. SCRIPTEOF WMNT User Data Outputs Emperor Feared More Than Chaos Script MD Final Reflection The Shape of Fear in the Grimdark. One of the things that separates Warhammer 40,000 from most other science fiction settings, the thing that gives it its specific emotional texture, the quality that keeps people coming back to it and digging into its lore long after the surface-level spectacle of power-armored warriors and ancient gods and galaxy-devouring hordes has become familiar, is its willingness to take its own darkness seriously. Not to wink at it, not to frame it as aesthetic backdrop to conventional heroic narratives, but to actually follow the implications of a universe as broken as the one it describes, and to ask what people who genuinely understand how broken it is actually do with that understanding. The Emperor is the setting's most complete answer to that question. He is what you get when you take a being of extraordinary intelligence and psychic power and give them the specific torture of understanding, truly, deeply, historically understanding how things go wrong. Not catastrophically, in the sudden way that is at least emotionally legible, but slowly, over time, through the accumulation of individually reasonable choices that collectively produce unreasonable outcomes, through the drift of institutions away from their founding purposes, through the tendency of power to corrupt and of corrupted power to perpetuate itself while wearing the language of its original ideals. He is what you get when the smartest person in the room has been in rooms where civilizations are built and broken for 50,000 years and has run out of illusions about how easy any of this is, but has not run out of the conviction that it is worth trying anyway. His fear, the deepest, most persistent, most specifically informed fear he carried across the entirety of his existence, was not a fear of what his enemies could do to him. His enemies were, in the final analysis, all expressions of the same thing. What happens when the conditions for human flourishing fail and the resulting emotional residue accumulates in the warp and becomes self-sustaining? Fighting the chaos gods without addressing the conditions that created them was, in his own assessment, the equivalent of treating symptoms rather than causes. Necessary, yes, but not sufficient. What he feared was insufficient time, the gap between what was necessary and what was possible, the narrowness of the window within which his plan could work, and the near certainty that the window was narrower than it appeared, narrower than he could protect adequately with the tools available to him, narrow enough that a single catastrophic mistake, a single Magnus, a single Horus, a single moment when a plan contingent on too many things going right, encountered, one of them going catastrophically wrong, could close it entirely. He was not afraid of the dark. He understood the dark. He had watched it form. He knew what it was made of and why it was there. He was afraid of the light that he was trying to sustain, being insufficient to reach the people who needed it before the darkness closed in around them completely. That is a very particular kind of fear, and it is the kind that cannot be resolved through power or through planning or through any of the tools that normally address the things people are afraid of. It can only be resolved by the outcome itself, by whether the thing you feared would fail actually succeeds or actually fails. And for the Emperor, that resolution has not yet arrived. The story is still going. The plan, in whatever form it still persists in the mind of the being on the throne, is still running. That is where we leave it. Not with an answer, because the lore does not give us one, and it would be a disservice to the richness of what is there to pretend otherwise. But with the question fully formed, fully articulated, in all its difficult and fascinating complexity, what did the Emperor fear more than chaos? He feared the failure of everything he had given his existence to. He feared it with the specific, clear-eyed terror of someone who understood what failure looked like and had watched it happen before and knew exactly how it would feel when it arrived. And he tried anyway. For 50,000 years, against every obstacle, through every catastrophe, in the silence of 10,000 years of imprisonment, he tried. That, in the end, is what makes the Emperor genuinely extraordinary. Not the power, not the age, not the plans, however brilliant, but the persistence. The refusal to stop trying, even when the evidence that trying might not be enough, was overwhelming. Even when the compassion that originally motivated the trying was gone, burned away in the fires of the heresy. Even when the specific future he had been trying to build was no longer achievable. He kept going, because stopping is the one thing that guarantees the worst outcome. In a setting defined by the phrase, "there is only war," that is an act of defiance, so complete and so sustained that it becomes, in its own way, the most hopeful thing the setting contains.